Dirt was baked hard as iron, and the shovel jarred my teeth every time it hit. I was digging a grave for a good mule when he finally appeared. He did not ride like valley men. He sat that gaunt buckskin like he was carved straight from the mountain granite. My name is Hiram. I run the last trading post before the earth tips upward into the serrated teeth of the divide. It is a harsh stretch of geography, a place that filters out the weak and hardens whatever is left behind. Most folks who pass through my doors are prospectors chasing phantom gold or valley ranchers looking for cheap fencing wire. You learn to read a man by his hands and his boots. The man on the buckskin had boots wrapped in raw hide, stitched with animal sinew. His hands looked like they had been forged in an anvil, knuckles thick with old scar tissue. Dirt worked so deep into the creases it had become part of his skin. He swung down from the saddle. No wasted motion. He didn't stretch or groan like a valley man would after a long ride. He tied the reins to the rail with a single practice knot and unslung a heavy canvas sack from the saddle horn. I leaned on my shovel, wiping sweat from the back of my neck. "Store's open," I told him. He didn't reply, just gave a short, tight nod and walked up the wooden steps. His spurs didn't jingle. They were bound in leather to muffle the sound. A hunter, a man who valued silence over announcement. I drove the shovel into the dirt and followed him inside. The interior of my post smelled of roasted coffee beans, oiled canvas, and cured tobacco. It was dim, the windows small to keep the winter draft out. My daughter, Abigail, stood behind the long oak counter. She was 24, and the frontier had stripped away any softness the eastern cities might have afforded her. She wore heavy canvas trousers and a faded flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. Her hands were stained with black ink from the ledgers and axle grease from the wagon she had been repairing that morning. She didn't flutter, she didn't simper. She worked. The stranger stopped at the counter. He dropped the canvas sack. It hit the wood with a heavy, dead sound. "Pelts," he said. His voice sounded like two stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who went months without speaking, a man whose throat was accustomed to breathing freezing air rather than shaping words. Abigail didn't flinch. She untied the cord and pulled the furs out. Timber wolf. High country beaver. Fox. They were prime. The winter coats were thick, the skinning precise, the tanning immaculate. There were no jagged knife marks, no bullet holes spoiling the prime sections of fur. "Trapped high," Abigail said, running her hand against the grain of a wolf pelt. "Above the tree line," he answered. She looked up at him. I watched from the doorway, keeping my mouth shut. Most men who came in here tried to impress her. They puffed out their chests, spun tall tales about Indian raids or silver veins. This man just stood there. He was tall, lean as a starved hound, wearing a patched canvas coat that smelled of pine pitch and old wood smoke. His eyes were the color of slate, guarded, constantly tracking the corners of the room. He wasn't looking at Abigail like a woman. He was looking at her like a factor in his environment. "These are good," Abigail said, her tone businesslike. $4 for the wolf, 2 apiece for the beaver." A valley trapper would have spat and demanded double. The mountain man just gave that same tight nod. "Need flour, salt, coffee?" "Ammunition for a Sharps 50 caliber." Abigail turned to the shelves. She began pulling down the heavy canvas sacks. The man stood perfectly still. He didn't lean against the counter. He didn't tap his foot. He possessed a stillness that made me uneasy. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. I stepped forward. "Name's Hiram. This is my post. That's my daughter, Abigail." He shifted his gaze to me. "Josiah." He offered no last name. Out here, a last name was a luxury and sometimes a liability. Abigail hefted a 50-pound sack of flour onto the counter. It was heavy, and a flush of exertion colored her cheeks. Josiah didn't rush to help her. He watched her work, assessing her strength. When she pushed the sack toward him, he picked it up with one hand, hauling it over his shoulder as if it weighed no more than a winter blanket. "Your total leaves you with $6 in credit," Abigail said, marking the ledger. "You want it in coin?" "Keep it on the book," Josiah said. "I'll be back before the snow flies." He turned and walked out. I followed him to the porch. He loaded the supplies onto a pack mule tethered behind his buckskin. He moved with an economy of motion that fascinated me. Every knot, every strap was secured with absolute precision. He didn't look back at the store. He mounted his horse and rode north, back toward the jagged peaks that loomed over the valley like broken glass. I walked back inside. Abigail was still at the counter, her fingers tracing the thick fur of the wolf pelt. "Rough one," I noted. "He doesn't waste anything," she replied quietly. Not the fur, not his words. She went back to her ledger, but I noticed she didn't look up again for a long time. November rolled in, carrying the bitter promise of deep frost. The valley grass turned brown and brittle, snapping under the hooves of the cattle. The wind shifted, blowing down from the peaks, smelling of ozone and frozen rock. Josiah returned just as the first flurries began to spit from an iron-gray sky. This time he didn't just trade and leave. He set up a small, Spartan camp at the edge of the tree line on my property. He didn't ask permission, and I didn't demand he move. There was an unspoken understanding on the frontier. A man caught in the transition of seasons was allowed to hold his ground until the weather declared its intentions. His camp was a study in survival. A lean-to of pine boughs, a fire pit no larger than a dinner plate to conserve fuel and hide the smoke. He spent his days repairing pack saddles with an awl and heavy waxed thread, his hands moving with rhythmic, calloused certainty. It was during this time that Harrison made his weekly visit. Harrison owned the largest ranch in the lower valley, 500 head of fat cattle, a Victorian house built from lumber, shipped all the way from St. Louis, and hands so soft they looked like they belonged on a piano player. He was a good man, by valley standards, polite, wealthy, safe. He had made it clear he intended to ask for Abigail's hand before the year was out. He rode up in a polished buggy, wearing a heavy wool suit that had never seen a day of hard labor. He stepped onto the porch, stamping the light snow from his expensive leather boots. Inside, Abigail was cataloging a new shipment of iron nails. Harrison leaned against the counter, smiling. "Abigail, you're looking radiant even in this gloom," he said, producing a small paper parcel. "I brought you some peppermint from the mercantile in town." Abigail took the parcel, wiping her dusty hands on her trousers. "Thank you, Harrison, that's kind." She set it aside, unopened. "Do you need feed today? We just got oats." Harrison chuckled, entirely missing her pragmatic dismissal. No, just came to see you. The town dance is next Saturday. I was hoping I could drive you down." Before she could answer, the front door rattled open. Josiah stepped in. The drop in temperature in the room was immediate. He brought the cold with him, smelling of wet wool and wood smoke. He carried a broken iron stove grate. He didn't acknowledge Harrison. He walked straight to the hardware corner, his slate eyes scanning the piled iron. Harrison puffed up slightly, offended by the intrusion. "Excuse me, friend. We were having a conversation." Josiah stopped. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Harrison the way a wolf looks at a tethered goat. Not with malice, just cold, objective calculation. He took in the suit, the clean boots, the soft jawline. "Talk," Josiah said, his voice flat. He turned back to the iron pile. Harrison flushed red. He looked at Abigail, expecting her to intervene, to reprimand the mountain man. Abigail simply picked up her clipboard. "If you need a new grate, Josiah, they're in the back crate." $2, she said. Outside, the wind suddenly howled, rattling the window panes. Heavy thump echoed from the barn. I stepped out onto the porch. The wind had ripped a section of the old cedar shingles loose. If the snow hit hard, the roof would rot, and we'd lose the winter hay. I cursed, grabbing my heavy coat. I was too old to be climbing icy ladders, but the work didn't care about my joints. Harrison stepped out behind me, pulling his wool collar tight. "Nasty weather blowing in, Hiram. I should get the buggy back to the lowlands before the trail freezes." He didn't offer to help. He climbed into his buggy, snapped the reins, and retreated to his warm, safe house. I grabbed a hammer and a canvas sack of nails. As I turned toward the barn, Josiah stepped off the porch. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't offer his services. He simply reached out and took the heavy canvas sack. From my hand, we walked to the barn. I set the ladder. Before I could put my foot on the first rung, Josiah pushed past me. He climbed with the steady, gripping grace of a rock climber. Abigail came out of the house, wrapped in a thick shawl. She didn't stay on the ground. She climbed up the loft stairs, throwing open the high-loading door to access the roof from the inside edge. For the next 2 hours, we fought the storm. It wasn't a job done with chatter. It was a brutal, freezing rhythm. The wind whipped ice crystals into our faces, stinging like birdshot. Josiah lay flat on the pitched roof, his long legs hooked over the ridge beam for stability. He drove the iron nails through the cedar with singular, devastating blows of the hammer. Whack, whack. Abigail stood waist-deep in the loft door, handing up fresh shingles and nails. Their hands met 100 times, his scarred, battered fingers taking the wood from hers. There was no lingering, no soft glances. It was survival. It was work. I watched them from the ground, holding the ladder. I saw the way they moved together. It was seamless. When Abigail ran out of nails, Josiah didn't bark an order. He simply reached back, palm open, trusting she would place the next batch precisely where he needed it. She did. When the last shingle was secured, the sleet was falling in sheets. Josiah climbed down. He was soaked through, his canvas coat stiffening with ice. Abigail met us in the barn aisle. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, her face flushed with the cold. She looked at Josiah. "Coffee's hot inside," she said. Josiah wiped the sleet from his beard. He looked at her, really looked at her. It was a look stripped of all polite pretense. It was the look of a man recognizing an equal in a world that usually only offered burdens. "Obliged," he muttered. That night, he sat at our table. He ate his stew mechanically, eyes focused on his plate. He didn't try to charm us. He didn't boast. But when Abigail reached for the heavy cast-iron coffee pot, his hand shot out, taking the handle before she could bear the weight. He poured her cup, set the pot down, and went back to his meal in silence. The next morning, his camp was gone. He had vanished back into the high country, taking the storm with him. The freeze came not with a howl, but a terrifying stillness. December locked the valley in a grip of iron. The thermometer on the porch dropped to 20 below and stayed there for 3 weeks. The timber cracked in the night like rifle fire as the sap froze inside the trunks. I was laid up. The cold had settled into the old arthritis in my spine, turning my lower back into a pillar of grinding glass. I could barely walk from the cot to the stove. Abigail ran the ranch. She fed the stock, chopped the wood, and hauled the water. She did it without complaint, her face setting into grim, determined lines. 2 days before Christmas, a section of the lower fence gave way under the weight of a snowdrift. 5 head of cattle wandered out, drifting toward the jagged ravines of the foothills. At 20 below, cattle don't survive long. They freeze where they stand. Abigail saddled her mare. She wrapped herself in 2 wool coats and took a coil of heavy rope. "Don't go past the tree line," I warned her from my chair, my voice tight with pain. "If you can't find them by noon, let them go." She nodded, her breath pluming in the freezing cabin air. "I'll find them." She didn't come back by noon. By 3 o'clock the light began to fail, turning the snow a bruised, dead purple. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my chest. I tried to stand, forcing my boots on, but my legs buckled. I fell against the table, gasping, helpless. I was an old man, trapped in my own failing body, while my daughter was out in the white death. I didn't know then what was happening up in the ravines. She told me later. She had found the cattle, huddled in a rocky draw, but the snow crust had broken under her mare's hooves. The horse scrambled, throwing Abigail into a steep, rocky gully hidden beneath the powder. She tumbled down, slamming into a deadfall of frozen pine logs. Her right leg was pinned below the knee under a massive ice-coated trunk. She struggled. She dug with her frozen, numbed hands, tearing her fingernails to the quick. The log wouldn't budge. The mare had bolted. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the temperature plummeted further. The air was thin, carrying a cold that didn't just chill the skin, but ached in the marrow. The creak down in the draw sounded like glass breaking underground. The hollow, pressurized groan of water fighting the ice. She prepared to die. She stopped digging. She pulled her coats tight, closed her eyes, and waited for the creeping lethargy of hypothermia to take her. Then she heard the crunch of snowshoes. Josiah had been tracking an elk down from the high ridges. The weight of his rifle stock against his shoulder was a familiar anchor in a world of white. He had found the mare's tracks, recognized the valley shoeing, and followed them to the gully. He slid down the steep bank. He didn't speak. He didn't offer useless words of comfort. He knelt beside her in the snow. His face was a mask of frost and concentration. He assessed the pinned leg, running his heavy, calloused hands over the ice-locked timber. "It's broken," Abigail whispered, her voice weak, shaking violently. Josiah unslung his pack. He pulled out a heavy steel hatchet. "Look away." He didn't try to lift the log. It was too heavy, anchored by the freeze. Instead, he swung the hatchet, burying it into the frozen wood inches from her thigh. Chips of ice and pine flew into the air. He chopped with mechanical, terrifying power. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It took him 20 minutes to sever the trunk. When it finally cracked, he jammed the handle of his hatchet under the wood, using it as a fulcrum to pry the weight off her leg. She screamed. The sudden release of pressure sent blinding agony up her hip. Josiah didn't coddle her. He pulled her free of the deadfall, laying her flat on the snow. He drew his hunting knife and slashed her canvas trousers open to expose the break. The bone hadn't broken the skin, but the leg was swollen and twisted. He gathered 2 straight pine branches. He stripped the leather lacings from his own snowshoes. "Bite down," he ordered, handing her a thick leather strap from his pack. She put it between her teeth. Josiah gripped her ankle, braced his boot against her good leg, and pulled. The bone set with a sickening pop. Abigail blacked out. When she came to, she was bound to his back. He had fashioned a makeshift harness from his ropes and pack straps. He was carrying her. She felt the immense, straining labor of his body. Every step he took through the knee-deep snow required a massive exertion of force. He was carrying his rifle, his pack, and a full-grown woman uphill, fighting the altitude and the killing cold. He didn't stop. For hours she listened to the harsh, rhythmic rasp of his breathing, the smell of his sweat, sour and heavy with exhaustion, mixed with the sharp scent of pine pitch. It was full dark when my cabin door burst open. I was on the floor, dragging myself toward my rifle, half mad with fear. The door slammed against the wall. Josiah stood in the frame. He looked like a demon forged from ice. His beard was frozen solid. His eyes were bloodshot, sunken deep into his skull from the unimaginable effort. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut. He knelt slowly, his knees popping like dry twigs, and gently lowered Abigail to the floorboards near the stove. I dragged myself to her. She was shivering, pale as milk, but she was breathing. Her leg was bound perfectly in a rigid splint. I looked up at the mountain man. He stood by the stove, leaning heavily against the iron pipe, his chest heaving. He didn't ask for gratitude. He didn't look at me for approval. He just stared at Abigail, his guarded eyes softening for a fraction of a second, revealing a vast, silent depth of fierce protection. That was the night I understood. Harrison could offer her a house, cattle, and a soft life. But out here, when the world turned its teeth on you, a soft life meant a cold grave. She didn't need a man who could buy her things. She needed a man who could carry her through the storm. Stories like this are best told when the day's work is done and the fire burns low. If you appreciate a tale built on hard truth and quiet endurance, consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who understands the value of a steady hand. Subscribe to our channel to join this community. We will gather around this fire again to hear how Josiah and Abigail fare when the valley pushes back. The trail stretches on, so ride along. April broke the valley open. The thaw was not gentle. It was a violent, sloppy transition. The snowpack retreated, leaving behind acres of thick, sucking mud that smelled of rotting pine needles and wet earth. The creek, choked with ice for 4 months, swelled over its banks, dragging dead timber and boulders down from the high ridges with a deafening, continuous roar. Abigail healed slowly. The bone knit true, but the break left her with a heavy, dragging limp that the damp air aggravated. She did not complain. She whittled a stout cane from a piece of cured hickory and went back to work. She took inventory, sorted the seed bags for the spring planting, and balanced the ledgers standing on one good leg. Josiah did not leave. By all rights, he should have been gone. The high passes were clearing, and the spring trapping season was short. Every day he lingered in the valley cost him fur and coin. Yet his canvas lean-to remained at the edge of the tree line. He didn't hover. He didn't offer unwanted assistance. He simply took over the heavy labor. I would wake at dawn to find a cord of wood already split and stacked by the stove. The broken hinges on the barn doors were forged straight and replaced. The pack mules were brushed and fed before the sun cleared the eastern peaks. He did this in complete silence. He worked around us, a shadow moving with deliberate mechanical purpose. It was mid-May when Harrison returned. The mud had dried enough to allow wheeled traffic, and Harrison arrived in his polished buggy, pulled by 2 matching bays. He didn't come alone. He brought 3 of his ranch hands, thick-necked men, who rode alongside the buggy with revolvers sitting high on their hips. A display of force. A display of ownership. I was on the porch, working saddle soap into a cracked bridle. Josiah was in the yard, sinking a new fence post with a heavy iron maul. Harrison halted the buggy. He tossed the reins to one of his men and stepped down, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. He ignored Josiah completely. He walked up the porch steps, carrying a small leather valise. "Hiram," Harrison said, his tone lacking the deference he usually feigned. "Good to see the post survived the winter." "Barely," I replied, not looking up from the leather. Harrison cleared his throat. "I've come to speak with Abigail, and with you. In private, if you don't mind." He cast a pointed glance toward the yard, where the rhythmic thud-thud of Josiah's maul echoed against the timber. Abigail stepped out the front door. She leaned heavily on her hickory cane. Her canvas trousers were dusted with flour, her hair tied back with a piece of twine. Harrison's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Abigail, I heard about your accident, a terrible tragedy. It breaks my heart to see you relying on a stick." "It holds my weight," she said flatly. "What do you want, Harrison?" He opened the leather valise. He pulled out a small square box covered in dark blue velvet. He didn't drop to one knee. He held it out like a merchant presenting a contract. "I came to take you away from this," Harrison said, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "This post is no place for a woman, especially one crippled by the harshness of it. I have a house with wood floors. I have servants who can cook and clean. I can offer you safety. I can offer you a life where you never have to chop wood or freeze in the dark again." He snapped the box open. A gold ring with a modest diamond caught the harsh afternoon light. "Marry me, Abigail. I'll buy Hiram out. You can both move down to the ranch. You'll never want for anything." The rhythm of the iron maul in the yard stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant rush of the swollen creek. I watched my daughter. I watched the man offering to buy her away from the dirt, the cold, and the danger. Abigail looked at the ring. She'd reach for it. She looked at Harrison's soft, uncalloused hands. Then her gaze shifted past him, out into the yard. Josiah stood by the fence line. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring out toward the jagged peaks of the divide, his heavy shoulders rising and falling with his breath. His hands rested on the handle of the maul, rough, battered, scarred hands that had swung an axe into frozen timber to pull her from the grave. "No," Abigail said. Harrison blinked. The confident smile slipped from his face. "No? Abigail, be reasonable. Look at yourself. Look at this place. You're working yourself into an early grave." I said no, Harrison. "Is the offer not generous enough?" he demanded, a flush of anger creeping up his neck. He snapped the velvet box shut. "Or has the isolation finally addled your senses?" Abigail gripped the head of her cane. Her knuckles turned white. "You don't understand this place, Harrison. You think you can buy the mountain. You think you can buy me with a wood floor and a servant. But when the winter comes, your money doesn't burn. Your money doesn't dig through the ice." She stepped closer to him. Her limp pronounced, her presence overwhelming. "You want a wife to sit in your parlor and look pretty," she told him, her voice low and hard as a whetstone. "I am not a parlor ornament. I belong to this dirt." Harrison's face went dark. He looked at me, expecting me to overrule her. When I remained silent, continuing to rub oil into the bridle, his anger boiled over. He turned around and pointed a trembling finger at Josiah in the yard. "Is this it?" Harrison sneered. "You're turning down a 500-acre ranch for a dirt-poor squatter. A savage who smells like animal grease and doesn't have 2 coins to rub together?" Josiah didn't move. He didn't look at Harrison. He simply stood there, a monolithic presence. One of Harrison's hired hands took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver. "Boss wants an answer, mountain man." Josiah turned his head, slowly. The movement was so deliberate, so devoid of fear, that the ranch hand froze. Josiah didn't reach for the heavy hunting knife on his belt. He didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the porch rail. He just looked at the man. It was the same look he had given Harrison back in November. A cold, objective calculation of a threat. The ranch hand saw something in those slate-gray eyes that made his blood run cold. He took his hand off his gun. He stepped back. Harrison saw it too. The bluster drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, sharp realization that all the money in his pockets couldn't stop the violence that lived in a man like Josiah. "You're a fool, Abigail," Harrison spat, turning back to his buggy. "You'll die out here, and nobody will care." He climbed into the seat, snatched the reins, and drove the team hard out of the yard, mud flying from the spinning wheels. The ranch hands spurred their horses and followed, a chaotic retreat down the valley road. I set the bridle down. Abigail stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle. Then she turned and limped back inside the trading post. In the yard, Josiah picked up the heavy iron maul. Thud. He went back to work, driving the post deep into the unyielding earth. 2 days later, Josiah began to pack. I sat on the porch, smoking a corncob pipe, watching him break down his camp. He worked with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else. The canvas lean-to was folded into a tight square. The ropes were coiled. The traps were bundled and secured to the pack saddle. He was leaving. The thaw was complete. The valley had been dealt with, and the high country was calling him back to the silence. A heavy weight settled in my chest. I had lived a long time, outlasting my wife, outlasting most of the men I had come west with. I knew how the world worked. Men like Harrison took what they wanted. Men like Josiah protected what they valued, and then they moved on, believing they had no right to claim it. He finished cinching the girth on the mule. He didn't mount his buckskin. He walked across the yard, his boots silent on the packed earth, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Trail clear?" I asked. "Snow's gone from the lower passes. River's high but fordable at the bend," he answered. His voice was a low rasp. He stood there. He didn't say goodbye. His slate eyes tracked the grain of the wood on the porch planks. His massive hands flexed at his sides. I saw a hesitation in him, a sudden, grinding internal conflict that was entirely foreign to the man I knew. "Speak it, Josiah," I said quietly. He looked up. His jaw tightened. "I have no land," he stated. The words were not an apology. They were an inventory of fact. "I have no cattle. I have 3 rifles, 4 mules, and the clothes on my back. I trap for coin to buy powder and flour." He stepped up onto the first step. He didn't look away from my eyes. "But I can build a cabin that the wind won't break," he continued, his voice dropping deeper, vibrating with absolute conviction. "I can pull meat from the mountain when the valley starves. I can hold a rifle steady when the wolves come." He swallowed hard. It was the only sign of nerves he had ever shown. "I am asking for your daughter, Hiram." He didn't say he loved her. The word had no currency out here. Love was a valley word, used in parlors and written in letters. Out here, a man showed what was in his heart by standing between the woman and the cold. I tapped my pipe against the rail, knocking the ash into the dirt. I thought of Harrison's velvet box and the 500-acre ranch. I thought of the heavy iron maul sinking fence posts. I thought of my daughter's screams in the winter night. And the sight of this battered, exhausted man carrying her through the snow, having torn the forest apart with his bare hands to save her. "Harrison came here offering a rich man's life," I said, my voice steady. I told him she didn't need a rich man. I leaned forward, looking at the calluses on Josiah's hands, the scars on his knuckles. I said she needs a good man. Josiah didn't flinch. "Are you a good man, Josiah?" I asked. "I don't know," he answered honestly, the grit in his voice unyielding. "But I am hers." I nodded, slowly. I picked up my tobacco pouch. "She's in the barn, fixing the harness you broke yesterday." Josiah didn't smile, but the tension in his broad shoulders broke. He gave that short, tight nod, the same one he had given the very first day he walked into my post. He turned and walked toward the barn. I stayed on the porch. I didn't follow. This was not a thing for an old man to watch. The barn was quiet. The heavy sliding door was open, letting in the slanting afternoon light. Inside, the air smelled of sweet hay, old dust, and neat's foot oil. Abigail was sitting on an overturned barrel, her bad leg stretched out straight. She was working an awl through a thick piece of leather, pulling the waxed thread tight. She heard his heavy boots on the floorboards, but she didn't stop working. Josiah stopped 3 feet from her. He didn't have a velvet box. He didn't have a speech. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. He pulled out a piece of polished bone. It was a comb. He had carved it during the long, freezing nights of December, shaping it from the jawbone of an elk. He had sanded it with riverstone until it was smooth as glass, etching a delicate, perfect pattern of pine branches along the spine. He held it out to her, and his hand, scarred and stained with earth, was perfectly steady. Abigail stopped pulling the thread. She looked at the carved bone resting in his palm. She understood the labor it represented. Hours of meticulous, freezing work by the light of a dying fire. She put the awl down. She didn't take the comb immediately. She looked up at him. "You're packed," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "I am," he replied. "Where are you riding?" "Up the North Ridge. Good timber there. Water." He paused. "Good place to build." Abigail looked at the comb again. She reached out. Her fingers brushed against his rough palm. She took the bone comb, turning it over, tracing the carved pine branches with her thumb. "Building a cabin is a 2-man job," she said quietly. "I know I can't carry the heavy logs, Josiah, not with this leg." "You don't carry the logs," he said, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. "You tell me where to put them." Abigail finally smiled. It wasn't a soft, simpering smile. It was fierce, pragmatic, and entirely beautiful. She slipped the carved bone comb into the pocket of her canvas trousers. She picked up her hickory cane and stood up, leaning her weight against it. She looked up into his slate-gray eyes. The North Ridge gets deep snow by November, she noted. We'll cut extra wood, Josiah said, his voice dropping to a low rumble for her ears alone. She reached out, grabbing the lapel of his heavy canvas coat. She pulled him down slightly, bringing his scarred face level with hers. "Then you better start chopping, Mountain Man," she whispered. From the porch, I watched them walk out of the barn together. Josiah walked on her right side, matching his long, heavy strides to the slow, dragging rhythm of her cane. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't need to. He simply stayed close enough to catch her if she fell and far enough away to let her walk under her own power. They walked toward the buckskin and the pack mules. They had a mountain to climb, a cabin to build, and a winter to prepare for. It would be a hard life. It would break them down, scar them, and test them until their bones ached. But as I packed the tobacco into my pipe and struck a match against the porch rail, I knew they would survive it. The valley had its gold, its soft beds, and its rich men. But the mountain had them, and they would hold their ground. Stories like these belong to the quiet hours, passed down when the fire burns to embers and the night pulls close. If you found a piece of truth in this high country tale, leave a like and share it with those who know the value of grit over gold. Subscribe to our channel and join this community to keep your place by the hearth. We have many more trails to ride and stories to tell. I will see you next time.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, a poor mountain man came ask for my daughter's hand, and I said, she needs a good man, not rich one. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the simple idea that a person's worth isn't measured by money, but by character, kindness, and how they treat the people they love. Sometimes looking beyond what someone owns can help us see what they truly have to offer. Would you rather see your daughter choose a wealthy man or a good man with little money? What qualities matter most to you when judging someone's character? In everyday life, maybe we can give people a fair chance before judging them by their circumstances. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man stories, feel free to like and subscribe.